This guy is like a full-on psychopathic killer. He's a paranoid little man who needs to stay in power to stay alive for the rest of his life. What he really wanted more than anything was to get me back to Moscow, torture me, and get me to retract all of my allegations about the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, the whole Magnitsky story, in an effort to somehow collapse the Magnitsky Act, which is the legislation which freezes assets and bans visas named after Sergei Magnitsky.
How does this endgame play out? Like, if you really had to think about it and think 10 years ahead, what's the most likely scenario that happens here? With Putin, with Russia, what do you actually think is going to happen?
Well, I think that this war is not going to end anytime soon.
So a year, 2 year, 5 years.
This could be like the Iran-Iraq war, could go on for 8 years.
Are nuclear weapons going to be used?
Probably.
It's not just a veiled threat.
I don't think so.
It's not enough just to be the richest man in the world, which you contend that he is. He's got to be the scariest guy in the world. He's got to be the everythingest guy in the world in order to hold power in a place like Russia, or in his mind to hold that power.
He's stolen so much money, he's taken so many people hostage, he's killed so many people, he's responsible for so much crime that if he ever were not to be president, he would be prosecuted, he would be stripped of all this wealth and fortune that he's created, and he'd probably die.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Bill Browder, the investor, author, and political activist, often referred to as the #1 enemy of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Your fund, Hermitage Capital, was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when you were denied entry to the country for exposing corruption in Russian state-owned companies. In 2009, your Russian lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was killed in a Moscow prison after exposing a $230 million fraud committed by Russian government officials. Since then, you have successfully lobbied governments all around the world to impose visa bans and asset freezes in your global campaign to target human rights abusers and corrupt officials. Your latest book, Freezing Order, is a New York Times bestseller recounting your story of Russian money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath. Bill, welcome back to London Real.
I'm really glad to be back. Thank you.
Great to have you here. It's been almost 5 years since you were here last time. You had just had your first book out. And you were about to start some of the adventures that you found out here, including going to Madrid and being picked up by Interpol. I remember last time you were here, Bill, and you would not accept a beverage from me. And I think I asked you about that. And I think I started to get a glimpse into the life you might lead, where you're maybe always worried about something bad happening to you. And maybe we start there, and then we can go into what happened to Madrid. But how often is something like that on your mind? You did accept a drink from me today, I noticed.
Well, since I actually knew you, since 5 years ago I met you, you didn't poison me, so I took the offer of the tea here, and I'm pretty sure that I'm going to be okay after this.
I mean, you're joking a little bit, but do you kind of like to meet people at first, or are you?
I've got to be super careful. I can't just be drinking and eating and meeting with people I don't know and so on. Everyone has to be vetted. But you've proven yourself to be not a Russian assassin, so okay. I'm good.
All right. So because I even told the guys today to just keep your eyes peeled. That's what I said. I said just keep your eyes peeled. I don't want any random cleaners or inspectors coming here. And I just told them that, and I'm just thinking, well, that's what I'm thinking, and I have to worry about this one day every 5 years. But this is something you're probably constantly thinking about. So
Well, it becomes kind of like an instinct. I mean, it's not, if you do the same thing, if you stay vigilant for long enough, it just becomes, you're vigilant without having to like be vigilant. In other words, it becomes as a habit. I do certain things as a habit. I don't do certain things as a habit. I have a whole protocol which I've mastered, and it's worked so far. I mean, knock on wood, but 13 years after I started this fight with Putin, and he really wants me bad. I mean, and there's, it's not just me saying it. I mean, we'll talk about it today, but there's like huge amount of objective information about how angry he is at me for all the trouble that I've caused him. And so, but here I am, 13 years later, I'm still alive. I mean, that's a huge accomplishment, I think.
It is. Why hasn't he been able to get you, do you think?
Well, I think in the past, he wanted to get me one specific way. He didn't want to use Novichok or apartment bombs or something like that, because what he really wanted more than anything was to get me back to Moscow, torture me, and get me to retract all of my allegations about the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, the whole Magnitsky story, in an effort to somehow collapse the Magnitsky Act, which is the legislation which freezes assets and bans visas named after Sergei Magnitsky.
Okay.
He really doesn't like that legislation. He thinks that somehow getting me to, make some statement on TV after having been tortured for 20 hours, then they can kill me after that. But he wants that's his, he has this fantasy of getting me to retract the Magnitsky Act.
Okay, and that maybe keeps you a little safer than if he just wanted to poison you here, which after we talked happened in the UK. He sent 2 guys over and they poisoned someone out. So
and it's happened in Russia, and it's happened all sorts of places. I mean, and there's a number of poisonings that we don't even know about. I mean, these guys there was a whole crew. I mean, like a big crew of Russian secret policemen living abroad, conducting assassination operations all over the place and succeeding. And so their big goal was to use what I call legal means. Legal means arresting me through Interpol or through an extradition request, getting me back to Moscow, torturing me, putting me on television, and then killing me.
Right. Okay.
And then to say to the West, guys die in prison all the time.
Okay. So that's a bigger payout that he was holding out for. You have sources that told you that.
Well, but more importantly, if he had killed me, I would have just become this international martyr, and there'd be sanctions and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Everybody, knew the Magnitsky Act. All these politicians knew me. That wouldn't have achieved his objectives better than what he had cooked up.
Okay. All right. And are you learning what it's like to deal with a man like Putin? And I was about to say even a Russian way of doing things. And is there a Russian way of doing things? I mean, when they poison people, they use a specific poison that's traceable. It's almost like got their signature on it. So they almost say, look, I did it without maybe it being provable. Do they play a game a little bit different than, say, the West plays?
Well, they play their own game, which is, so Putin historically has done all this sort of asymmetric, plausibly deniable, talking out of one side of his mouth saying, I'm a killer, talking out of the other side of his mouth saying it wasn't me. That's his modus operandi. And the West doesn't do that. I mean, we're not conducting, poisoning operations all over the world. That's a Putin thing. That's not a West thing.
Right. He uses that asymmetric warfare. So whatever resources they use, it's a bit of a form of terrorism, right? You can use something that has an asymmetric effect. You could argue that's what's happening in Ukraine right now as well, where they have a little bit of poison, they go here and do that, and it causes this asymmetric effect on the world in form of fear and terror. And it's also probably putting fear into the oligarchs as well.
Well, so Putin's whole big thing is that he's got to be the scariest guy around. That's how he succeeds. We've seen him to be kind of incompetent. I mean, his war machine. We thought the Russian military was the second most powerful military in the world. Well, I think that the Poles could probably deal with them in an afternoon. They're probably like number 13 in the world. But you don't have to have the best military in the world if you're the if you're just a crazy guy like Putin and ready to do anything and going around, it's kind of like a guy, walking around the neighborhood, with a knife and just, everyone just wants to avoid him. That's sort of Putin's big thing, is like to say, I'm the guy with a knife in the neighborhood.
You said one time that it's not enough just to be the richest man in the world, which you contend that he is, but he's got to be the scariest guy in the world. He's got to be the everythingest guy in the world.
Exactly.
In order to hold power in a place like Russia, or in his mind to hold that power.
Yeah, and that's how he's done it. Russia's not an easy place to hold power.
Yeah.
It's a big country, and there's a lot of people, a lot of nasty people, just as nasty as him, wanting, a bite at the apple. He's the richest guy in the world. Other people want that. And the only way to do that is to just be so scary to so many people that everyone's like, I don't want to mess with that guy.
Also, I was watching House of Cards recently, and there's this, fictional scene where the Russian president comes over and he's talking to, the president, and he says, our presidents don't retire here. And is that a real thing in Russia? Where, they have had presidents retire, and Gorbachev, died of old age, but when he leaves, it's very dangerous for him potentially. So when he wants to stay in power, is he fighting for his life sometimes?
Yeah, I think you've hit the crux of everything that's going on. So, in theory, he could leave power like anybody else, but he's stolen so much money, he's taken so many people hostage, he's killed so many people, he's responsible for so much crime that if he ever were not to be president, he would be prosecuted, he would be stripped of all this wealth and fortune that he's created, and he'd probably die. And he's a paranoid little man who needs to stay in power to stay alive for the rest of his life. And that explains everything that we're involved in right now. That why did he invade a foreign country? He doesn't have any beef with Ukraine. If you were to objectively just ignore all rhetoric that he's said.
Is it not the breadbasket of Russia? Does he not have to keep NATO from coming in and encroaching? Are there not some reasons, not justifying the war, that he's doing that?
Well, so let's look at all these. So NATO. So while this has been going on, Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Far more menacing than Ukraine. They are real militaries. The Finns could give Russia a run for their money any day. Is he going to war with Finland and Sweden right now? This is just pure smokescreen hype to justify something much simpler. To use another analogy, wag the dog. So this is a wag the dog war. There's no beef between Russians and Ukrainians. There's no Nazis in Ukraine. Zelensky's Jewish. It's absurd. And so if he really wants to create a Russian empire, there's a lot easier places that we don't care about that he could be going to. But he wanted a war. He wanted a war, and he chose Ukraine, and they started concocting this whole, Nazis, fascists, blah blah blah, back in 2014 to justify the invasion of Crimea. And by the way, there's a great chart which explains everything. If you look at it, it's Putin's approval rating over time, assuming you believe it. But for the purpose of this argument, let's just say it's true. Every time his approval ratings start to flag, 2008 he goes into Georgia.
Yeah,
it starts going down again. 2014, Crimea starts going down again. 2022, full-on Ukraine. It's just purely war as a strategy and a tactic for him to get everybody behind him. And by the way, it's also really good for him to get rid of all these pesky journalists and get rid of Facebook and Twitter and all this stuff that just right. makes life difficult for him. And he can just have a bullshit message that he spreads around through his state media, and nobody knows any different.
Right, clean house. Never let a good crisis go to waste, and he creates one, and they can use it to clean house.
And get rid of all the intelligentsia who didn't like him. They're all gone, and so he's got a sort of much more passive, docile population that's ready to put up with whatever he's got going so he can stay in power.
Okay. And Wag the Dog refers to that famous movie where they created a war as a media event. So was it other dealings that the president, people wouldn't focus on those? They would focus on
there
the
was
war.
some kind of embarrassing thing going on. So they created a war with a fake country or something like that.
Right, okay. So he's done that here, and it's working for him because his approval is back up.
85%.
Right. And you said before that this war doesn't get settled. Either Russia wins or Ukrainians win, but Putin will not come to any kind of treaty or treatise because that's not part of the game plan.
Well, so everyone always asks me every day, what's the end game? And they're all reading Putin's speeches and thinking, well, he said something about NATO and he said something about, wanting this Donbass. Why don't we just give him NATO and give him Donbass and then everything will be solved and we can all go back to... But that ignores the elephant in the room, which is that that's not why he's doing this. And so, first of all, we can't give him Donbass because that's ridiculous. Why should he get that? Why should he be rewarded for an aggression? But secondly, he's not going to stop there. He'll just keep on going and going and going because the purpose of this is to be at war. Right. And so he has no incentive. So whenever there's a, quote, negotiation, he puts out some unreasonable terms knowing that no one was ever going to agree to those terms. He can't have a negotiation because if he negotiates and stops, then the whole purpose of this thing has disappeared. Right. He looks weak.
Right, which means approval ratings drop and ultimately it ends in his loss of life in some scenario earlier than he wanted it, right?
He wants, he's 70 years old. He wants to go until he's like 90 years old or whatever.
Yeah. And again, you said that scenario earlier. If some of the presidents get elected and he stays in Russia, he's finished and he's got nowhere else he can go. So there's no good end game for him.
None.
Even an optimistic one. The next ruler of Russia is going to find some way to get rid of him. And they're very good at that there, right? And if he can't flee, because there's just nowhere for him to go.
He maybe goes to North Korea,
right.
or Saudi Arabia, but that's not what he wants. I mean,
right. And then after a while, maybe they won't want him there anymore.
No, of course not. They're going to want to have good relations with somebody, and he'd be a prized hostage to hand over for good treatment somewhere else.
Okay, so understand the motivation, and then you can understand. Yeah, when I see some of the announcements coming out, it's like when you hear North Korea negotiating. It's like it's all nonsense. It's like first there's a grain deal, then there's no grain deal. North Korea's like, oh, first we're going to do this, now we're not going to do this. They have one trump card, and they keep playing it over and over and over again. And if you believe anything they say, it's the joke's on you because they have one end game, and that's always that end game, and they feed you little bits of talking points in the meantime to get you going here and here and here and there.
And we're all so steeped in our own sort of Western values that we think that he's dealing like
project on him.
We think he's like us. He's not. This guy is like a full-on psychopathic killer. His heart doesn't start beating faster if a child was being tortured to death in front of him. He would feel nothing. He has no empathy, no conscience, no moral boundaries, and so we can't look at this guy and say he said this in this speech. He said this. That must be what he's trying to do. And by the way, all the people in Washington, all the policy experts, political scientists, are all sitting there reading his speeches and looking for hints about what he's doing and then reporting to their bosses, this is what they're trying to do, let's make a policy around this. You can't be a political scientist to deal with Putin. You need to be a criminologist to deal with Putin.
Right. But the only guy that rules Russia for 20 years and out of the situation he found it is that guy you just described, right? Is there any other guy that can do that?
He's the guy. Yeah.
I hate to say this. Does that country need a psychopathic ruler? Is it that crazy over there? You spent a lot of time there.
No, it doesn't need a psychopathic
If you look
ruler.
at the history of Russia over 500 years, and my dad read this one time, and he said it's just a repeating cycle over 100 years. You could say that about most countries.
Well, Russia has got a particularly bad past. They had the Tsars, they had communism, and then they had this. And it's, there were 10-year periods where things were kind of okay.
A lot of it's the geography, right? It's a tricky thing to keep together.
I think that's a myth.
Really?
I think it's a myth that's a tricky. Canada's got a big geography. Really, it's got it's huge.
I know, huge. But there's geopolitics involved in that whole region, and it seems to repeat itself on a regular basis.
I think that they just have had no tradition of non-murderous dictators.
Okay. Is it cause or effect? That's the question. But either way, we're here. You say Putin's the richest guy in the world, and most people would say, no, Bill, that's Jeff Bezos. Can you talk to me about why you believe he's the richest man in the world and how he got to be that wealthy? And you know this because you spent time in Russia creating wealth yourself, $4.5 billion at one point from basically nothing. And so you saw how it all worked. I was wondering if you could just give us the quick version of how that happened.
Well, so Putin comes into power, and he sees these oligarchs who are all rich, and he says, why am I a little guy and they're all the big guys? And so what does he do? He arrests the richest oligarch in Russia. He puts him in jail, and everyone said, oh no, he'll be out of jail in 2 seconds. There's no way a rich guy can stay in jail. And they sentence him to 10 years in prison. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos.
Yeah.
They stick him in jail, and all the other oligarchs say, oh my God, this is serious. And they go to Putin and say, what do we have to do so we don't go to jail like that guy? He said, it's real straightforward, 50%. And by the way, if you don't want to go with the 50%, I'll just take 100% and you go to jail. And so
how do you get that number 50%? Because I remember you told me this last time you were here, Bill, and you were the first guy that ever just put it flat out like that. Putin has 50% of all the oligarchs' wealth in some type of contract between those two.
Well, it's not a written contract, right? Because it's a contract that he can only enforce
right when he's in power.
If he's president.
Right.
And so,
which means you have to have approval ratings. So his
well,
net worth.
He doesn't need approval ratings. He just needs to control the place with all of his strong men and so on. I mean, approval ratings are helpful,
right?
So that people don't rise up. That's sort of his, that's his insurance policy. But the main insurance policy is well, actually, he has. Guess how many presidential guard members there are in Russia. Just give me a wild.
Presidential guard members. This is like a Secret Service type thing, like an equivalent.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the president of America, I'm just saying, probably doesn't have as many as you think. There's probably 100 or something. I don't know.
500,000.
500,000?
500,000 people are working the Russian presidential guard. I mean, and why does he have so many? Because he wants to have his own army. So if the army ever goes against him, and these people are better paid, more luxurious accommodations, everything. Yeah, they're like the creme de la creme. And by the way, they're not sending them as cannon fodder to the front line of Ukraine. These guys are there to protect Putin.
500,000.
500,000.
He's very smart.
He's bad at almost everything, except for securing his own safety.
Okay. What's he bad at?
He's bad at armies. He's bad at governing an economy. He's bad at. I mean, Russia had every advantage in the world when he started. The West wanted them to succeed. They had a highly literate population, more literate than America, a fully installed industrial base, natural resources coming out of their ears. If this had been managed properly 22 years ago, they could have been a country like Germany or Japan. But instead, the size of the Russian economy is the same as the state of New York. And it's just his total and absolute criminal mismanagement. I mean, it's negligence of a scale you can't even imagine.
I mean, when I grew up in the 80s and, the Rocky movies were happening, there were two superpowers in the world. It was Russia and America. And that's the way we thought it would probably be for 50, 100 years. Now you could argue now that Russia will never, ever be a superpower ever again. And all they have is their natural resources, and they've kind of squandered every other opportunity to be leaders in technology, to be leaders in any other kind of innovation.
I mean, it's a country blessed with everything. They're blessed with natural gas. They've turned off the natural gas to Europe. So the Europeans are going to say, okay, you can turn it on, we're going to depend on you from now on? No, of course not. The Europeans are going to say, we're going to find secure forms of gas into perpetuity from somewhere else. And so the Russians have built all these pipeline networks and everything, and they've lost their main customer. I mean, you can't, having natural gas means nothing if you can't sell it to anyone. Yeah, they may be able to sell it to Chinese. That'll take them another 15 years to build those pipelines. They've got all these super smart computer scientists. Do any of them stay in Russia? No, they're all going out to California where they can actually start companies and they won't get stolen from them.
Right, or they won't also be conscripted that way as well.
Indeed.
The people in Russia, I mean, they're not stupid. They have social networks, they have technology. How do they buy into all of this when they can see their country not going to where it should go?
Well, a lot of them don't buy into it. I mean, if you were to survey, people between the ages of 18 and 30, 4 years ago, before all this really nasty stuff started, I think a majority of them wanted to emigrate to the West. I mean, it's obvious. There's no mystery about it. But anyone who's in Russia, is chanting, long live Putin, because you're not allowed to say anything other than that.
And they're scared, and there won't be a revolt because he's got the security locked down.
Locked down completely. He's probably figured out how to read people's faces for disloyalty, and even if it's even if it's his face disloyalty machine. I'm just making this up, but even if it was wrong 20% of the time, he'll just kill everybody, and just in case anyone's that 20% was so what if 20% were loyal?
I read a couple years ago they were installing the face recognition cameras in the Moscow subway system to make it easier to do the fares, and it was just fascinating to realize that it was also a great way to spy on people. And
of course, everything they do is spying on people.
Are they as good as the Chinese are at that?
No, they're bad at everything.
Right.
I mean, they
but they still do it, or try to do it.
Yeah. Well, they do it for different reasons. So they're spying. Yes. I mean, they have all this information. How they process it is, you've got a bunch of C students from D universities with no motivation that are, reading all the feeds coming in, trying to figure out what to do with it. So they're not very good at that stuff. They have it all.
Okay.
Chinese are much better.
All right, I want to finish with Putin, then I want to get into the book and then a little bit more of the Magnitsky Act, because it's important to maybe talk about what you did and the effect it's had and the effect it will probably continue to have in the future. How does this endgame play out? Like, if you really had to think about it and think 10 years ahead, I mean, what's the most likely scenario that happens here with Putin, with Russia? If you look 10 years ahead, maybe 30 years ahead, maybe 50 years ahead, what do you actually think is going to happen?
Well, I think that this war is not going to end anytime soon.
So a year, 2 year, 5 years.
This could be like the Iran-Iraq war, could go on for 8 years. You could have 1 million dead on both sides. That's the kind of war that we're looking at right now. How does it end? It ends either with Ukraine winning or Russia winning, or some stalemate where eventually everybody just completely runs out of steam to do this, which is going to be a long time in the future, maybe after Putin is gone.
Are nuclear weapons going to be used?
Probably.
It's not just a veiled threat.
I don't think so. Putin will do anything. I mean, he does such outrageous stuff. He just does all the time, and he's thinking, okay, he's going to go and lob a nuclear bomb over some part of Ukraine, and he's thinking, what are we going to do?
I know.
Are we going to no, we're not going to enter into a nuclear war with Russia over that. That's what he's thinking, and we probably won't even attack. I mean, because we don't want to be at war with Russia.
Yeah.
So he's thinking maybe then he'll demoralize the Ukrainians into surrendering because he kills 1 million or 2 million Ukrainians.
Is that the scenario of what might happen?
Easily it could happen.
So he puts a low, medium level nuke in there. It kills that many people, makes it radioactive for the next few hundred years.
And then he says, look, America did it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Why are you getting so mad at me?
And then the whole world is outraged and then do nothing.
Yeah, that's his...
Right, just like the world's been outraged before and done nothing when atrocities happened all around the world.
Yep.
Rwanda,
yep.
You could even say Nazi Germany, people knew. You
Yep.
could say these atomic bombs.
Yep.
You could say even now. So
Yep.
everyone's outraged, but then no one's going to do anything because
Yeah.
the US is not going to go in and start a war, and I don't think any European nations are, and it's really tragic. It's hard to watch, isn't it?
It's horrible.
It's horrible to watch, and it's so close. I do a little bit of breakdancing, and I know a breakdancer, and he's in Ukraine, and his Instagram every day is giving updates, and he's like, it's Monday morning, and this is when we get bombed by the Russians, and I know you don't care because you're sick of hearing this. And this is something that happens every day. And a year ago, he was just a guy that was dancing in his country and known around the world. And now he posts these messages, and it's literally happening across the border from Poland in the EU, right here, while we all go about our business. And these drones are coming over and dropping these things that look inhuman to kill people. And we've got a potential nuclear missile going in, and it's plausible. You know,
I mean, it's more than plausible. It's likely.
It's likely. I know, and that's something I would probably agree with you. The fact that this is happening in 2022 is, it's hard to believe.
Yeah, and this one guy.
It's one guy. So how does this play out? He dies of old age. This war continues.
Well, so if the Ukrainians can continue the trajectory, and they're doing a pretty good job on the battlefield. I mean, they're highly motivated. They understand that if they don't win, then They get tortured, imprisoned, their women are raped, their children are stolen, their communities are destroyed. And so they have for them, I mean, that's a real motivation to fight in a battle. Yeah. So they're really motivated to fight, and we're giving them a lot of tools to fight. We're giving them a lot, but we're giving them just enough to hold the Russians back, but we're not giving them enough to succeed. And we could actually end this war ourselves.
We, the West, America?
Basically the United States. The United States is the key.
They're giving them arms, but not enough.
And they would admit it. If you go to speak to someone in Washington and the high level in the U.S. government, they'll tell you that. They'll say, we don't want to, they're kind of afraid of what happens if Putin loses.
Because that would upset him and he might come after us, or if he loses, they're afraid of what's going to happen. Why?
They just think, it's probably better just to leave this at a low level, not to poke the bear. Like always, this has always been the appeasement strategy of Russia. Everyone's afraid of this guy, and he's done a great job of, he creates, 90% of his power is because we acknowledge him as being powerful.
Okay. If we get rid of Putin, does it get worse?
Well, how does it get worse
I don't know.
You have a guy threatening nuclear war. How could it possibly be worse? This is a big myth that Putin has created.
So you don't think it gets worse?
This is as bad as it gets. I mean, it could get much worse because he's going to make it much worse, but it's not like another guy is going to be worse than Putin. He's a monster.
But the U.S. won't arm the people to win. You're saying they won't?
At the moment, they won't. But what's interesting about the U.S. approach to this is like every time Russia does something more atrocious, we give them better arms. I mean, we could have just given them better arms from the start.
Right.
And we could give them the better arms they need right now before, yes, we would probably give them the long-range missiles they've been begging for after the first nuclear attack, but they should get the long-range missiles now so maybe avoid the first nuclear attack.
Right. I can't believe that we're actually talking about a potential nuclear attack that's going to go into the environment and leave whatever.
Yeah, we're all going to have to take iodine here, and we're all going to be watching and just with our jaws at the floor when 500,000 Ukrainian people have been decimated by a nuclear weapon that Putin launches.
It'll make Chernobyl look like just a blip. Okay. Yeah, this is scary stuff. Super scary. All right, so then this keeps going on, and then sooner or later, I mean, Putin can't last that long. 30 years, he probably can't last.
Well, so what happens eventually is, if the if the Ukrainians were to succeed in this war, the Russians have no patience for a weak strong man. You can be a strong man, but you got to be a strong man. You can't be a loser strong man.
Right.
And so the Russians will come and take care of him very quickly, which is one of the reasons why he's so desperate to keep this war going. Right. So that's one scenario. And if that scenario happens, then the whole system breaks, and anything good can come from a broken Russian system. There are some good people in Russia: Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Karamurza, Ilya Yashin. These are all sitting in jail. These are all opposition people who stood up to Putin, who could form the next new non-war, Western-oriented government.
Okay.
Or you could have a situation where Putin drops dead in his bed tonight, and the next guy that takes over in a highly organized transfer of power is some other monstrous character who's just as bad as Putin.
Right. Okay. So these are both scenarios. Let's talk about the economic sanctions that are happening now because of the war, and also the Magnitsky Act and how those are related, and maybe briefly what the Magnitsky Act was all about and the effect that it had on Putin, on oligarchs, on everything.
Well, let's start with the third question and work our way into the first two. So the Magnitsky Act was named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. It was passed in the United States. It freezes assets and bans visas against individuals who do terrible things. So it sounds pretty obvious. If someone does a terrible thing, freeze their assets and ban their visas. How hard could that be? And no one's going to vote. If you vote on that law as a senator, you're not going to lose a vote in any constituency in America. Really obvious. But it wasn't so obvious when I went out and started to work on this thing. The previous sanctions had been just like, we stopped selling to that country. And I said, well, wait a second. Why don't we just pinpoint, target, surgical strike against the individuals? And everyone said, yeah, that makes sense. And the more I talked, the more it made sense. And we ended up getting it passed 92-4 in the U.S. Senate and 89% of the House of Representatives.
Were you surprised it passed with that much of a majority?
No, it's obvious. It was like motherhood and apple pie. It's it's a no-brainer.
It's also government, but all right.
It's a no-brainer. And then in Canada, we got it passed with 100%. And on and on and on. And that it now exists in 35 countries. And I was going to all these places and giving speeches in parliaments and meeting members of the government and so on and so forth. And softening the ground, explaining to them why it's a good idea, and they all did it. And so the moment that Ukraine happened, instead of having to everyone is running around like headless chickens, what's our policy? They said, wait a second, let's use this thing. We have this template, let's go after the individuals. I mean, there's a lot of other things going on in terms of response to Ukraine, but this was one of the main responses. Let's go after the oligarchs who hold Putin's money. Let's go after Putin and all the people around him. Let's target their assets. Let's freeze their assets. And we're now even talking about seizing those assets. And this was a direct result of the Magnitsky Act.
It was, but it wasn't the Magnitsky Act per se.
No, the Magnitsky Act was the template. They call it the Ukraine something something Act. But
okay.
But it's all the same exact template. It's all the same basis, and everybody and guarantee you that if I hadn't spent 10 years going around and explaining to every member of parliament in every country that this is the way to do things, there'd be like 15 different policies about how do you respond to Russia economically.
Is it fair for us to seize the assets of individual Russians for an act that Putin does in Ukraine?
Yeah, because they're holding assets for Vladimir Putin.
Is that provable? Is that provable in a court of law?
Well, so if you can show that these people have gotten those assets from Putin's largesse, I don't see any reason why that's not. I mean, yes, it's provable.
In theory, I see that. It's just I saw very quickly a lot of assets seized in London and all around the world. And I don't know, I could see why people wanted to do it, and I could see it in theory, but I also wondered, was there due process there?
Well, you can take them to court and say, okay, where did you get your money from?
But they seized it first. It was like ask questions later.
No, this happens all the time. Let's say that you and I were in a business deal, and then you ripped me off, and I could go to court without you being there, here in London, proper legal system, and I can get what's called an ex parte freezing order. And I would tell a judge, this guy ripped me off, I want to freeze his assets because he's going to abscond, and you need to freeze him before he absconds. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing. And then you can come back to court and say that's not true, and we can argue about it. That's the same thing that the governments have done. All the oligarchs have an opportunity to go back and say, yeah, I'm not a friend of Putin's, I didn't do this, and you should unfreeze my assets, and then you can have a proper discussion in a court. But these guys would, and we've seen them. We go after an oligarch, and they're like literally hightailing it on their yacht, out to the high seas to try to protect their yacht from being frozen.
Right. But why didn't they do this before the invasion of Ukraine?
Because the oligarchs didn't know this was going to happen.
Okay, but you see where I'm going with this. I mean, it took Putin going to war with Ukraine for them to come in and now say, all right, we're seizing your assets.
Oh, why didn't we seize their assets before? Oh, well, we should have. We should have seized them when Russia invaded Georgia, or when Russia took Crimea, or when Russia carpet bombed Syria, or when Russia poisoned people in Salisbury, or a million other things that Russia has done so horribly. But everybody was so narrowly, all these politicians were all putting their blinders on and so narrowly focusing on Russian gas or Russian investment or just not wanting to rock the boat that everybody gave Putin a pass for 22 years.
Is there any backlash, or will there be a backlash from all the seizing of Russian assets on the back of this war, or not?
Well, I think there'll be a backlash if that money is not converted to paying for Ukraine.
Okay, so you're happy it happened. You wish it would have happened sooner, and it's doing the right thing. It's sending the message back to Putin and to everybody associates with him that this is not okay.
Well, more than that is saying, Putin, we're going to starve you of your economic resources.
Right.
We're going to make sure that wherever we can, where we have power over it, you're not going to get that money.
What percentage of his wealth is gone now, you think, from the seizing? Still a small percentage?
Well, nothing's been seized yet. It's all just been frozen.
Well, all right, frozen then.
So $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves have been frozen. And then we also have
$350 billion
that
were located in other central banks?
Correct.
Okay.
So when the Russians want to hold euros, they hold it at the European Central Bank.
Okay, $350 billion.
$350 billion. It's a hell of a lot.
What do you reckon Putin's worth?
I think that Putin, well, it's hard to know, what's Putin's and what's the Russian state's,
If you had to guess, you thought it was 200 billion a few years ago.
Yeah, I haven't done a calculation. I don't want to throw a number out here today, but it's a lot of money. It's like hundreds of billions. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So they seized 350 billion of just the state reserves.
Yeah,
it was a lot of money.
And then we're just getting started with the oligarchs. I mean, I think about 40 or 50 billion of oligarch money is frozen. Just Abramovich, just by himself, has 7 billion frozen in Jersey and another 7 billion frozen in the Cayman Islands. That's 14 billion, just one guy.
Do you have any sympathy for Abramovich?
No, how did he make his money? It was just through, backslapping good old boy stuff in Russia.
Are you shocked that it took the West this long to take action against these billionaires that have traipsed around the world and bought football clubs in London and mansions in Chelsea? That this long they let it go on?
It's terrible. It's just terrible.
All right. So the chickens have come home to roost to a certain extent over the past few months.
Yeah.
Is that maybe I hate to say that, but a good thing about the Russian-Ukraine war? Is it finally...
There's no good thing about the Russian-Ukraine war.
But finally these oligarchs are being held accountable, and maybe they never would have been.
Well, I mean, finally we've all woken up to how evil Putin is. But the trouble is that we've woken up too late. We had an opportunity to tie him up tight, to contain him a long time ago, to create really serious consequences a long time ago, where we might not have ever been facing this situation.
Okay.
And we just blew it.
This was 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
He started doing bad stuff in 2008 when he invaded Georgia.
Right, but it's like pulling the Band-Aid off. What were you going to do, though? You couldn't go in.
You couldn't go in. You do exactly what we're doing right now.
Right.
You could have freeze their assets all over the world.
Right.
Supply weapons to the Georgians. Let Ukraine into NATO and not have any of this stuff.
Okay, so it's the same story. It's just not, the West doesn't do enough until it's too late. That's what you're saying.
And this has happened in so many different situations in history. I mean, in World War II, it's the same thing.
Is this because of our 4-year election cycle in America, or is it just the fact that
it's just the fact that everybody wants to just not have trouble?
Okay, all right. I guess I could see partially a reason for that. So the assets have been seized. A percentage of Putin's wealth is now seized and frozen, but it's not enough to slow him down, and he only has one choice anyways.
Well, so here's the elephant in the room, which is that we've frozen 350 billion of central bank reserves. We've frozen the oligarchs. We got sanctions on Sberbank and Vneshtorg Bank and all this kind of stuff, all good, on Gazprom. But one of the things we don't do is we continue to buy Russian oil and gas to the tune of $1 billion a day. So, I mean, if you think about it as a business person, we've dealt with his savings. The savings are all tied up. I mean, he doesn't have easy access to his savings. So the balance sheet is not in great shape. But the income statement, he earns $1 billion a day. And he spends $1 billion a day killing Ukrainians. And as long as the West continues to buy $1 billion a day of oil and gas, he can run this murderous war into perpetuity.
Can the West afford not to buy that gas and oil?
Yeah, I think there's other people who can buy oil and gas from. But there's one possible saving grace from this whole thing, which has nothing to do with any government policy, which is we're going into a nasty recession. Interest rates are going to go up farther than anyone will be comfortable with. All of a sudden, your mortgage will be double what you thought it was before, triple. And at the same time, they're probably not going to raise them high enough to contain inflation, so everything will be expensive. And as a result of that, we're going to go into a recession. And what happens during recessions? The oil price drops. And if the oil price were to drop to $30 or $40, which is entirely possible in a nasty recession, then he's pretty much out of business.
Mm. There's a great book about Reagan's Secretary of Defense. I forgot the name of it, but he was going around the world trying to lobby to get the price of oil down and talking to the Saudis because they knew every dollar it dropped, it was making Russia weaker and weaker and weaker. And
crush them. And that's what crushed them.
Right.
It was $10 a barrel.
Yeah.
It wasn't Star Wars or anything like that.
Yeah.
It was
cash flow.
Yeah. And so everything always comes back to money.
Right. Isn't that crazy? And so,
to continue watching the rest of the episode for free,
visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.